Hello and welcome to this week's International Relations with Professor Pushpesh Pant. In this particular lecture, we are going to take up two or three interesting topics. What we are going to do is we are going to have a close look at a region which is proximate to India and very important from the point of view of strategy, commerce, and culture for India, the region of Southeast Asia. The region is in a flux. This region has millennia-old ties with India. We are providing a lot of historical background for this particular lecture to you in the PDF. So we will not read over the PDFs, but we'll leave the PDFs with you. So to enable you to read them at leisure and refresh your historical background and the context of what we are discussing. Broadly speaking, the word Southeast Asia came into existence only during the Second World War when First Lord of the Admiralty, Mountbatten, was commanding the naval headquarters in Colombo, and the region south and east of India was termed Southeast Asia by him. This region is broadly comprising of two civilizational streams, shall we say. One is the influence of India, the other is China. So the name of countries in Indochina region signifies this, that this is where the divide is between the cultural influences of India and China to ancient civilizations. The countries today in this region belong to two broad categories, the ones which are island countries, archipelagos like Indonesia, islands like Philippines, small tiny island states like Singapore, large state island Borneo, which is part of Malaysia, part of Indonesia, and a small sultanate of Brunei there. You also have the mainland Southeast Asia. This world is broadly the Malay world. Then you have the mainland Southeast Asia, which has Malaya, now Malaysia, which has Myanmar, now earlier called Burma. You have countries adjacent to Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand, which have Vietnam is certainly not part of the Malay world. Philippines has a distant relationship with the Malay world, and Indonesia is the large archipelago which from Andaman Sea stretches across to Papua New Guinea. So if you see the vast expanse of the land, you will get to understand what it means to us. So we shall begin immediately. And once again, I would like to advise you that don't read through the PDF slides one at a time. Read them slowly, absorbing the information there and correlating it to what we are going to discuss. So the first few slides, which you shall see the screens, we will rush through them. We'll rush through them not because we are in a hurry, but we are in a hurry to make you understand what is happening in the current and how it has been shaped by events in past, not of millennia, not only of since Second World War, but in the past 2 decades. Besides Southeast Asia and Flux, we are also going to discuss with you another incident of importance. It is the Doklam Bhutan changes which have seemed to have surfaced, where Bhutan has made a statement that there are 3 parties to a conflict, India, China, and Bhutan, which seems to be a significant change in its earlier position. We shall discuss that also. So this time, our lecture is devoted to proximate neighborhood, strategically important for us, also commercially and culturally. The important thing which you must remember is that the Southeast Asian region arguably is a region with a split personality. It has imbibed influences from India, as we said. It has imbibed influences from China. It has been deeply influenced by the European colonial impact and also the racial divide between the Malays and the non-Malays, the people who have been related closely to the Chinese ethnicity. There may be people having relationship ethnicity with Chinese, but also millennia-old animosities like Vietnam. The Tuam Chin sisters fight against Chinese domination dates back to almost 1,000 years. So you have that. Now, how India influenced the relationship with Southeast Asia is that from 3rd century BC to practically 13th century of the Common Era, Indians had very vibrant trade relationship. They traded in valuable commodities like sandal, spices, precious gems, silks, and so on. And this was an entrepot. The Arab traders came here, the Chinese trader came to Southeast Asia, and India was the crossroads. So this maritime spice route, as well as the Silk Road, connected us with India to China, and particularly the spice route with Southeast Asia. So this influence which traders took brought with them language, literature, cosmology, mythology, concepts of kingship, diplomacy, which left their deep mark on Southeast Asian countries. 13th century onwards, the Islam had advent in this region. Many sultans and pirate kings converted to Islam, but it did not mean that Indian influence ceased. The firm civilizational foundations of these countries, their identities, remained rooted in Indic, Indo-Buddhist concepts which had traveled from kingship to language to cosmology. Look at this map. This map gives you the directions of trade, and you can see what a vast expanse was this. At one time, this was referred to as Greater India. Now it is considered to be politically incorrect. It was the French who said Indianized states of Southeast Asia, dating back to Champa, Funan, and 2nd century BC. But look at this map, and you can see India, Southeast Asia, and the position of China. So the two actually interact in this region from times immemorial. Now, what has happened is the Islam which came to Southeast Asia was of the Sufi variety, tolerant variety, liberal variety, the same kind of Islam which was practiced in the Indian subcontinent. So the current fundamentalist Wahhabi aggressive interpretation of liberal intolerant Islam was not what we are talking about. So Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism coexisted in this region. So you had Ramayana, Mahabharata, you had Sufi silsilas, and you also had Angkor Wat, Borobudur. So from architecture to art and literature to music to epics, we see this. There was great tumult during the Second World War. What happened was when the Japanese advance began, it threw out the European powers. They did not know that they were such men of straw. They expelled them from Indonesia. They expelled them, the Dutch from Indonesia. They expelled French from Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. They expelled the British from Burma, Malaya, and Singapore. So you see, they ran over Southeast Asia and they proposed a scheme of East Asia co-prosperity sphere. This was in a name. It was basically Japanese hegemony, Japanese exploitation of the resources, men and material of these countries to firm up their war effort. So there was resistance to Japanese occupiers, but the Indians, under the leadership of Netaji Subhash Bose, formed an Indian National Army here. It allowed Netaji to be on the winning side in the first phase of the war. He could unfurl the tricolor in Andaman, but the victory was not long-lasting. When Japan was defeated after the Hiroshima-Nagasaki, then the wrath of the people turned against the Indians, who they thought had sided with the Japanese. Now, this you keep remember, and what helped India regain some of the prestige in Southeast Asia was Nehru's championing of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, anti-racialism, policy of peace, the formation of the non-aligned movement. A high watermark was Bandung Conference in 1955 in the Panchsheel, and Nehru and Sukarno stood side by side. But this did not last long. The Chinese succeeded in driving a wedge between India and Indonesia. So soon there was another formation to compete with the non-aligned movement, the organization of new emerging forces. Sukarno became stridently more anti-colonial. Nehru was projected as a reformist, running dog of imperialism, anglicized person. And during the Cold War, the American military alliances, SEATO and ANZUS, also drew Southeast Asian countries away from the non-aligned camp. And although India was appointed the chair of the International Control Commission to bring about peace in Indochina, India was economically very weak. India was dependent on foreign food aid, and India could play only a limited role. It was crippled to play a more active diplomatic role. China forged the Jakarta, Pindi, Peking, now Beijing axis to alienate India further. India was isolated very badly after the Sino-Indian War of 1962, and most countries in Southeast Asia, if they did not side with China, they did not side with India either. This was a moment of great disappointment for India. In 1971, the India forged a treaty of peace and friendship with Russia, stood up to the American browbeating, liberated Bangladesh on humanitarian grounds, and most countries in Southeast Asia had to take a relook at emerging potential of China. Now, this is the background, the historical background, and things have not changed much since then. So where are we today? when we talk of Southeast Asia and the flux, the country which comes to our mind immediately is Malaysia, which lodged the historical deal in Beijing, has covered, but also is apprehensive about the large looming shadow of China which falls over South China Sea. And if the 9-dash line is accepted, that most of Malaysian positions in eastern Malaysia, in Kalimantan Utara, North Borneo, would be disputed territory with China. The Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has overseen the signing of 170 billion ringgit, which is US $38.6 billion worth of investment commitments by Chinese firms. Some would argue that the Chinese investments are a debt trap kind of a thing. They only benefit Chinese companies, but this is not the time to do that, because the Chinese, despite being under great pressure of these charges in Sri Lanka, in Nepal, in Bangladesh, in African countries, continue to be generous, deep pockets to part with these investments. The other interesting thing about Anwar Ibrahim is that he was a firebrand Muslim youth leader, and he also was a favorite protege of Dr. Mahathir Mohamad at one time. The two fell apart. He was charged with sodomy. He was put in jail. All his political ambitions seem to have been razed to dust, but he has made a phoenix-like comeback. And because his predecessor, the Malaysian Prime Minister, has been charged with massive billion-dollar corruption charges. He belongs to a very distinguished family of dynasts in Malaysia. But then, if this happens, Anwar Ibrahim has forged a majority at the moment, but Malaysia has also a very odd political system, the federal system, where by rotation the sultans become the head of state, and they are not mere figureheads. They are meant to be only mere figureheads, and they are meant to be figureheads and meant to be symbols of power. But many of them have great popularity, and they can exercise control over political happenings. Also, one should not forget that Malaysia now has been under the influence of more intolerant, more dogmatic Islamic preachers. Some people like Dr. Zakir Naik, who has been expelled from India, now he's taken shelter in Middle East. But as long as he was in Malaysia, the problem was very much there. So Anwar Ibrahim has to moderate his policies from protege of Mahathir to his student youth politics days to a more mature leader today who has to worry about peace and harmony in his country. Malaysia also is not only a federation run by a special rotational system of sultans. It is a multi-ethnic country where almost 48% of the people are Chinese, 31% are more of Chinese origin, and the rest are of people of Indian origin. These percentages have been reducing constantly. The Malays call themselves Bhumiputras, the son of the soil, and the federal coalitional politics, which was at one time UMNO, United Malay National Organization, which had Malays, which had Malay Indian Congress, which had Malay Chinese Association, those are things of past. Right now, there are only either extreme orthodox conservative Islamic parties. There is no role for a democratic secular party, which can be easily introduced in Malaysia today. Also, nobody would have the guts, like in India, to perhaps argue about reservations or special interests of the Bhumiputras, the sons of the soil of the Malays. So many Malaysians of talent, Chinese and Indians, have migrated elsewhere. One should also not forget that these populations, the Chinese and Indians, had been introduced to Malaysia by Malaya then, by the British colonial masters. So they belonged to the plantation labor workers or skilled workers of other kind, and they were supposed to be influenced by extraterritorial political leadership, either in China or in India. This may not always be true, but Anwar Ibrahim has to make a very delicate balance when he recently made a trip to China, that he has to negotiate a maritime dispute between the two countries. China claims sovereignty over the South China Sea, and $3 trillion worth of shipborne trade passes through Straits of Malacca. So it is not only of interest to Malaysia, it is of interest to India also. The interesting thing is that so-called democracies in Southeast Asia have been moving into Chinese camp slowly, which we can see by the happenings of the past week. Why do we call it so-called democracies? Is that there have been authoritarian regimes. Even if you take Singapore, which is a single-party state, it's a city-state, is an island state, it is a very small population, 90% of Chinese ethnicity, Mandarin speaking, very strict discipline, more or less an authoritarian, benevolent dictatorship from the days of Lee Kuan Yew to his son, Brigadier Lee. Now, this is Malaysia, again, remains a democracy, but a democracy with a very specific tilt towards an Islamic state and also growth of illiberal politics, autocratic tendencies, large-scale, gigantic corruption, which marks it, this authoritarian streak. So whether it's 92-year-old Dr. Mahathir or it is Nazib, the prime minister charged with gross corruption, who was supposed to have laundered money received as a gift or a loan from the Saudis. So the veil of opacity in which this democracy operates in Malaysia is also very odd. Now, if you can't by any stretch of imagination call even the Indonesian government a totally democratic state. But although in Indonesia's case, the difference is that the constitution recognized after its liberation from Dutch colonial rule, the role for army, a nationalist army was recognized. Role for Islamic parties was recognized. Also, the role for a Chinese-led Communist Party was recognized, but after the bloodbath of the Chinese in 1965, 68, this has been given up. And there also you have, at times, the cult of personality. For long-term, General Nasution, before that, the cult of personality of Sukarno, and after that, Suharto. So you have this kind of thing where you see that the largest, most populous country in Southeast Asia is not genuinely democratic. I mean, it's hard to say who's genuinely democratic, but strong authoritarian streak, strong intolerant streak, and drift towards fundamentalist Islam. The same in Malaysia, the same one can say about Philippines, which they imitate a model of the American presidential system, but they also have had dynasties, they also have had intolerance, they also have curbs and limitations of freedom of speech, LGBTQ rights, and so on. In both these countries, in Malaysia and Indonesia, India also has very interesting trade relationship. India is the largest buyer of the palm oil from Malaysia and Indonesia. Both Malaysia and Indonesia are also oil-producing countries. Indonesia has high technological competence also. It is an ambitious space program. So there is a possibility of India collaborating with ASEAN countries, particularly with Indonesia and Malaysia, where we have had close ties in past. But then India has been so focused on larger countries or strategic consideration of larger countries in this region that we treat right now AUKUS more importantly, we treat Quads more importantly, we treat Indo-Pacific role for India more importantly, and we tend to forget our bilateral relationship with these countries. You could also see that majority of the Muslim nations have voted in favor of China's position at the United Nations when it comes to the persecution of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang region. India is one of the largest Muslim populations in the world in any country, but we don't seem to have the nerves or the guts or the political inclination at the moment to put China in the dock about the Uyghur Muslims. Our own uneasy relationship with the minority population in the country makes it very, very defensive in this context. The Chinese have backed the dams that will power Indonesia's new capital, Nusantara. Nusantara is the word in Bahasa Melayu, Bahasa Indonesia for the archipelago. This will involve clearing rainforests in Borneo. This will mean some kind of an ecological threat. It would also threaten the lifestyles of the indigenous people untouched so far in Borneo, Kalimantan, by Indonesia, and we might have a situation like Brazil changing land use in rainforests when new capital comes up, and whether it would be another opening the floodgates for large-scale corruption is something worth watching. Now, China might very willingly jump in here because it would allow a possibility of the Chinese companies having promising prospects here. So this is something which you have to worry about and go over this carefully. Then one other topic which we intend to discuss with you is Doklam, India, Bhutan, and China. So China is the common, shall we not say enemy, but adversary wherever India looks diplomatically. If you look at Southeast Asia, it looms large. We have not discussed Myanmar this time. We shall do it at length some other time. But Myanmar is a military dictatorship. And ever since the military dictatorship took over, India has been also following a policy of realpolitik, giving primacy to our national interest and not going by values like idealism, democracy, human rights, etc. We did not support Aung San Suu Kyi. Aung San Suu Kyi, unfortunately, lost a lot of goodwill by coming out with racist anti-Rohingya statements. But the Chinese continue, regardless of the change in political power, to have a very firm foothold in Myanmar. And this is what India would have to look very carefully. But then we come to Doklam, India, Bhutan, and China, which was recently in news. What made people apprehensive was that before we proceed any further, let's have to look at the historical background. For much of its history, Bhutan has preserved its traditional exclusion from outside world. It was a protectorate of the British, and when British left, it agreed to accept India's advice in foreign policy and in defense, and it would accept a limited sovereignty as long as the country was not ready for modernity. The kings of Bhutan have shown very great wisdom and farsightedness in slowly progressing towards self-rule and democracy. Bhutan is often discussed as one of the happiest countries in the world, which ranks highest in the happiness index. But as far as India is concerned, India's unhappiness increases when Bhutan, in its happiness, chooses to adopt a path of much greater independence, which seems to be opening threats for India's strategy in its relationship with other neighbors. Bhutan is a landlocked country. Bhutan is like Nepal, has to tread very carefully between China and India. But when Bhutan says that Doklam, the tri-junction, where India, Bhutan, and Chinese territories meet, has three parties to a dispute, India pricks up its ears and listens very carefully, because India has long ago ceased to guide Bhutan in foreign policy. India has also accepted that Bhutan can import arms from any country without letting India know what it is doing. But at the same time, it cannot remain indifferent to a bilateral conflict so far being suddenly turned into a tripartite conflict. Why does Bhutan do this? Is there a generational problem? That the younger generation of elected political leaders in Bhutan want to flex their muscles and play a role as a genuinely sovereign nation? Or they think that the earlier rulers, the kings, the monarchs, were pro-India, but they have no role in a post-feudal emergence of Bhutan. But Bhutan is very, very keen on retaining its cultural identity, its traditional way of life. But Bhutan now is open to internet and television, satellite television, and also China's salami slicing in Bhutan, and like in Arunachal, slowly occupying land which they dispute. Can India take on China in Doklam as it did a few years back, if Bhutan is not prepared to give a total support to it? Now, Bhutan has slowly begun to assert its independence since 1970, but India renegotiated the treaty, 1949 treaty, in 2007. The new treaty replaced the provision of requiring Bhutan to take India's guidance to in broader sovereignty, and Bhutan would not have to require India's permission, but one expected that there would be general agreement on major issues. This map would help you understand the intricacies of what this strategic situation is. Bhutan, India, and China. Is undisputed that the territories meet at the tri-junction. But does it mean that Bhutan can, earlier which it said that Bhutanese interest and Indian interests where to keep Indians out, suddenly say that China is a much too large neighbor and it has to think about it. Over the past 2 decades, many factors have forced Bhutan to settle its long territorial dispute with China. It's a much smaller country compared to India. It can't resist as much. And some would argue that even India has not been able to resist very firmly. These factors and its changing economic condition, transition to democracy and modernity, and dramatic rise of China and military which it witnesses, and reports of intermittent Chinese villagers being built in Bhutanese border probably have caused concern in Bhutan. 6 years after the Indian-Chinese face-off in Bhutan, the Bhutan's prime minister has said that Beijing has an equal say in finding a resolution. Now, this is something like Pakistan arguing that there are 3 parties to the Kashmir dispute because the Aksai Chin area, because the Gilgit-Baltistan area, which were earlier Gilgit Agency, part of the Jammu Kashmir Riyasat, are disputed also. China wants the tri-junction to be shifted approximately 7 kilometers south of Batang La. You go back to the map and have a look at it where it is. If this were to happen, the entire Doklam Plateau would be legally become a part of China, and it would become strategically very difficult to resist any advance across this. The Bhutan-India border adjoins the states of Assam, Arunachal Pradesh, West Bengal, and Sikkim. So keep this in mind. The small outline map you saw does not show all this. But Bhutan's King Jingbe Kesar Namgyal Wangchuk visited India from April 3rd to April 5. In the backdrop of this comments of the Prime Minister Latay Shering over the Bhutan-China boundary issues, and some crucial questions remain to be discussed and answered satisfactorily. So this is all we have for you this time. Till we meet again next week, thank you and goodbye.